John sat with his grandmother on the balcony terrace overlooking West Bay Road in Lower Hampshire Valley. The lush green fields from springtime were now singed brown. The lack of rainwater that summer was turning the place into the Mojave Desert. A screaming hawk flew overhead. Much like John, it was basted and blazed by the sun. The worn complexion of his grandmother's skin was more noticeable when the two sat beside each other in the sunlight. John lived in Goshen with his mother and father. He'd just finished school for the summer and was interning as a columnist from Gemini Inc. His past 2 summers he'd spent lifeguarding at the Highland Reservoir in Goshen. The pay was satisfactory at best, but John was going into his senior year of this upcoming autumn and had made no associations for after college. By his second semester of junior year, John had switched his major from environmental science to journalism. The National Center for Education Statistics states that 80% of college students will change their major at least once over the course of their 4 years. John had managed to triple that number by the end of his junior year. Finally, one day, John went to visit his guidance counselor for the millionth time, asking to switch his college major yet again. When John walked into her office that day, she could not help but chuckle a tiny bit. "You switch majors the faster than a politician switches sides at a fundraiser," she proclaimed. "Don't know what I want to do," he merely replied. "Well, let's start from the beginning," she suggested. "What are your interests?" John was baffled by her question. Not once had a member of the faculty asked him a question so personal. It was nice to have his opinion be put into consideration for once. "Well," he began, "I suppose I love to read. I also enjoy writing. Back in high school, I wrote an article to the Daily Reminder regarding Charlie Baker's administration promoting rehabilitation against the opioid epidemic in the Commonwealth. It didn't make the front page news, but I got a check in the mail the next week for $250. She smiled widely at him and said, "I know just what you need." John stuck with journalism throughout the rest of junior year. It was the longest he had stuck to one subject since he first went to college, and was even making a couple summertime courses over break. He knew he wouldn't be able to graduate on time with the rest of his classmates, but this did not bother him in the least bit. As for his visit to Applewood Retirement Community, today's visit was not of the customary sorts. His grandmother, Patricia, lived alone at the Applewood Retirement Community for nearly 2 decades. Ever since John's father moved away and since John's grandfather, Byron Holtz, was struck with a case of death. On this afternoon, John had brought his notepad and pencil and an old tape recorder he dug out of some boxes in the garage. John pushed the record button and initiated their conversation. So how did you and Granddad first come to Northampton?" "How did we come to Northampton?" She contemplated the question for a moment or two, then replied, "Well, in 1968 it was the old way women used to travel, following their husbands. We came to the city with nothing but a pocket full of change, a penchant for hard work, and like most people back then, big business dreams. Unfortunately, neither one of us had the business skills nor knew anything about starting a business, so we had to make do with what we were dealt. The city was still a very vibrant place even in those days. It was a place with very much integrity, architecturally speaking. Yet still there was very few buildings that didn't have boarded up second floors. The diversity in those times was also different. The Puerto Rican community was much greater back then than it is today, but due to prejudices, the Puerto Rican community was restricted to areas such as Hampshire Heights or Florence Heights. The city itself was a politically active community. The streets were usually filled with protesters at City Hall who admonished America's involvement in Vietnam. The police said the citizens clashed against one another repeatedly, day after day and night after night. I can't remember the first time I heard about the state hospital. Most people just called it the insane asylum, that cuckoo's nest, or loony bin. I didn't know very much about it before your grandfather started working there, just that it was an awful place and that some nefarious acts was going on." John remembered when his grandmother first told him about the insane asylum. He was very young at the time, and all she said was, "It's the place where the men in white coats take you away to when you are not feeling so well." But that's not the way the kids in school described it. John remembered it as the place where the men in white coats came in a truck with no windows, a truck that was charcoal gray. It rolled up onto the curb in front of your house, and the men in white coats came and took you away from your family and made you live in a room made of soft, white walls. It was a place that didn't allow its residents to write home to their families with pencils or pens, but instead used crayons. She reached over for her cup of tea, which had lost its fresh cloud of vapor and was now being hassled by a horde of fruit flies. She sipped it and then she cleared her throat. "It's been nearly 50 years since then, and I may just be some old spinster, but I ain't senile just yet. Everything your grandfather said back then was the truth. Make yourself comfortable, John, because the story I'm about to tell you will be very long and very disturbing, but you'll know the truth." The facility resided on First Prince Street, on top of Hospital Hill on the outskirts of Northampton, Massachusetts. The main building was a looming stone of horror perpetrated by the landscape at the end of the 19th century. A very sort of impenetrable-looking place was the general term people used to describe it. Growing from either side were stone walls built by one over the previous 100 years, mostly with federal money that began flowing during the Lyndon Johnson years and never stopped. The original hospital building, built on the Kirkbride model in an Elizabeth style. The hospital was completed in 1858 and was opened as Northampton State Lunatic Hospital, but members of the Commonwealth found the name to be somewhat pejorative and sometime at the turn of the century renamed it just Northampton State Hospital. Jutting from one side of the main building was an outdoor corridor 40 yards long and spanned 20 feet in width, and enclosed in heavy chain-link fencing was what the staff at the hospital called the Chicken Run. While all residents at Northampton State Hospital run well, there were others who were beyond saving and could not be permitted to roam the courtyard freely like some other patients. The Chicken Run was meant for the mentally ill, that were considered to be harmful to themselves and others if given the chance. Each patient who was permitted onto the Chicken Run received 2 hours of recreation each day, as long as the weather permitted it. During the colder seasons, patients would go 5 or sometimes 6 months even without stepping outside of the rooms. Some walked, some jogged. Most simply stood out in the open or would rest their backs against the chain-link fence looking over the facility grounds, often watching the staff and the other patients walk about freely outside the mesh wire. If they were lucky enough, the patients would sometimes see deer feeding on the grass on top of the ridge. Byron Hotz walked alongside Captain Eric Jack. Jack was tall, well-built, and symmetrical, with a crew cut and a pair of horn-rimmed glasses. He was head of the security staff on the night shift. They walked up a winding stairwell. The paint on the walls was chipped and washed out. At the top of the stairwell was a steel frame door corroded with rust. The building's edifice was not on par with state regulations, as there were no yearly inspections back in those days. Dr. Albert Duque was the head physician and superintendent of the facility in those days. The facility's main building was in dire need of repairs, and there had been no additions made since 1912. While Duque kept the place afloat, he was forced to run an institution that was both understaffed and underfunded. Nevertheless, he managed to keep the place afloat with some spit, baling wire, and nickel and dime appropriations from the state legislature. It was an act of see no evil, speak no evil, which only left the patients of Hospital Hill to suffer in a place that reeks of madness and nightmares, a place where only the insane could survive. For the most part, they would just keep them quiet and keep them sedated with clomazepine. That was pretty much the idea back then. Captain Jack took a set of brass keys clipped on his waistband and unlocked the door. The door opened inward, revealing a stark and desolate corridor, with 2 columns of panel lights staggered from one end of the hallway to the other. The width of the corridor was large enough for 2, maybe 3 normal-sized people to walk side by side. Doctors and staff members walked around in white overcoats, peering through the iron mesh on the doors. All the doors were the gray of unburnished silver, dull and dotted by years of water corrosion. Normally there would have been some fancy matching knob, but instead there was only a shaft of cold and black metal. Byron counted 12 doors on each side of the hallway. The only difference was each one was numbered differently. One bold and one fat number on the plain gray composition of the door's facade. All the doors were locked from the outside. Byron peeked through the mesh on each door as he walked by. The rooms were small and barren, with a mattress on the cold floor and a single blanket for warmth. The screams of horror can be heard through the paper-thin walls. The clear majority of patients he saw lying on the floor or in hospital gurneys and dressed in white gowns. Some had their faces pressed up against the glass of their windows. The screams of horror can be heard through the paper-thin walls. The majority of patients he saw lying on the floor or in hospital gurneys and dressed in white gowns. Some had their faces pressed up against the glass of their windows and stared aimlessly into the outside world. It was at that moment that Byron realized why the townspeople referred to this place as Hell Hall. It was not a treatment center, but a holding facility where society put away God's neglected children. "This is a place where people are sent to be forgotten," Jack said. Midway down the corridor was a small panel box with the words inscribed in bright red lettering, "Fire Hose," clearly one of the hospital's obscure methods of treatment. All the windows in the rooms were barred shut from the outside. The glass was opaque from grunge and dust or soot. Jacques removed the keys from his waistband and handed them off to Byron. He did not know what to say at first. He felt as if he'd been dealt a bad set of cards. Perhaps this wasn't my best idea, he thought. Like everyone who comes through here, staff included, you will hate this place in the beginning. Soon after you will grow accustomed to the standard of things around here, and then eventually you will come to depend upon this place, said Jack. The way he said that, depend on this place, it made Byron's skin crawl. Eventually you will come to depend upon this place? I don't think so. Welcome to the night shift, Mr. Holtz. He extended his hand to Byron. Byron shook it. 2 quick pumps. His hand was dry and grainy. Shaking hands with Jack was like shaking hands with a fistful of salt. Just then a single fleeting thought crossed Byron's mind. What have I gotten myself into here? He came home every morning with a spiteful look on his face. A malign look, you might say. It was then I knew that the stories of Hospital Hill were true. That it was a place that if anybody had any choice at all would not go there. I didn't really know any of this for sure, but that was the image that I had, and it was the image most people seemed to have, said John's grandmother. When exactly did you begin to notice a change in him? John asked her as he leaned over the armrest of his chair. I think it was sometime after that first month. I started with a patient by the name of August Haskell. There was never a dry moment in those days. Patients screamed wildly throughout all hours of the night. Some screamed, others laughed. However, these were not snickers or chuckles, but convulsive cackles and guffaws. One patient whom worried Byron the most resided in room 5 on the 3rd floor. August Haskell, a demented man who bared a striking resemblance to Montgomery Clift. Byron remembered reading in the newspaper one morning 2 years prior how Montgomery's body was found by his live-in personal secretary and companion, Lorenzo James. Clift was found lying nude on top of his bed, dead from what the autopsy called occlusive coronary artery disease. Perhaps this was him, Byron thought. Perhaps the news in the memorial services was just a cover-up story to hide the truth of what really happened to him. The simple fact that all the hooch and nose candy sent to him over the edge and put him right here in this hellhole. Haskell ogled at Byron through the iron mesh every time he walked by. He licked the brim of his mouth and leered at him. Byron did not falter at the sight of this. At first it bothered him, but eventually you become accustomed to it and numb yourself to the oddities of this place. He remained seated in his chair when he was not busy, which was most of the time, conducting his hourly well-being checks and reading The October Country by Ray Bradbury. Byron was never much of a reader until he became an adult. Before then, most of his literary time consisted of reading the Fleer's Funnies, which came wrapped around the bubblegum he chewed regularly at work. Back before his wife and him moved to Northampton, Byron worked as a corrections officer at Baldock Correction Facility in Warren, Maine. Much like his current job, its inhabitants were defiant. The only difference was that nights in Baldock were mostly quiet, while here on Hospital Hill, the screaming never ended. He became fidgety at work and needed some way to engage his time. It wasn't until his wife brought home a series of books from the library one day for him to read at work. At first the books didn't appeal to his liking, but with enough time he grew attached to them like images to a mirror. It was some time after 2 a.m. when he heard an indistinct sound, a sound that was unusual even a place such as this. The sound was downgraded to a shy whisper, but was rhythmic like fingernails tapping across a chalkboard. But the most peculiar thing was the fact the sound was coming from down the corridor from outside the rooms. Suddenly, something dashed across the hallway. Byron picked up his flashlight and proceeded down the passage. He moved cautiously as the movement was almost human-like. Had one of his patients been able to pick the locks on the doors and use the opportunity of the nightfall to escape? Not that Byron disagreed with the patients. Locked away here was truly a living hell, and much like hell there was punishment. There was torture and a disconcerted need to escape this unforgiving place. When he came around the bend in the corridor, he pointed the rays of his flashlight down the hall, from where the sound originated, from then back the other way. When he looked, he saw nothing. The corridor was empty, and all that was left was the intolerable sound of the wind, which had risen to a near gale from outside. Suddenly, from behind Byron, screams were heard coming from Haskell's holding cell, and a loud clashing like hard object hitting another. It was no ordinary scream in itself, even in a place like this. This was a Wilhelm type of scream, like in the Raw Walsh film, Distant Drums. Byron rushed back down the corridor to see his cell. He peered through the mesh wire on the door, but no sign of Haskell. He shined the flashlight back and forth, finding nothing but a discarded mattress. Against his better judgment, he removed the keys from his waistband to unlock the door. He hadn't familiarized himself yet with all the keys. Finally, after his 4th try, he heard the tumblers begin to shift from within. A warm burst of air greeted him upon walking in. The room smelled like the inside of a jockstrap. There was the lingering sense of unease as he stepped into the darkness. He took 5 paces in when his foot caught on something. He staggered a few steps forward, then caught himself on the far wall. When he looked down at his feet, his face was the color of white, fresh milk. Haskell laid face up, his mouth hinged agape, his eyes wide with distress. His hair stood up, perfectly on end, in a cone. As they say back then, he was as dead as a salmon in a fishmonger's basket. "Was there an inquiry?" John asked. "Of course," his grandmother replied. "Rapid eye movement, or REM, for short as they called it. What a load of bullcrap that was. A sleeping disorder in which the hostess physically acts out in response to their dreams. In most cases, they behave violently. Forensics found fragments of concrete in the indent on his forehead. The autopsy said that his brain was knocked loose from the connecting tissue, but there were scratch marks all along the back of his neck, as if someone or something was forcing his head into the wall. At first we thought he did it to himself, but now after what I know, I'm not so sure." John fondled the idea for a minute, then asked, "What happened then?" She breathed deeply, finding her voice for what came next. "August Haskell was dead. They incinerated his body in the old furnace down below the building's main edifice. These were the guidelines back then. This is what they did to all the ones who were without family. Those with families were often planted in an unmarked grave out behind the building's courtyard where the sun don't shine. There weren't very many mourners for them, and Dr. Dukai wasn't one for spending taxpayers' dollars on sentimental services. There was no money in the budget for ceremonies or any fiddle-faddle of that sort. Paranoids, schizoids, cyclodes, catatonics, semi-catatonics, men who grew wings and went to heaven and hell in a New York minute, women who burned children's arms off with Bic lighters, alcoholics, pyromaniacs, kleptomaniacs, maniac depressives, and the classical suicidals. We later discovered that a woman just a few weeks before had committed suicide with a bed spring in that same room. Her name was Lauren Hostetler, a junkie on the streets who exposed herself to sodomy in exchange for drug money. It was a tough world we lived in. If your head wasn't bolted on right, you were going to shake, rattle, and roll before you turned 30. It was a problem we all dealt with in our own ways. We thought better yet, we hoped, that would be the end of the strangeness, but things only worsened from there. Byron friended a man by the name of Jared Tillman, a second member of the security staff at the state hospital who had spent most of his career riding the night train. Unlike all the others who worked security at the malls, jewelry shops, and local convenience stores, Tillman served 6 years as a military police officer in the Marine Corps and was deployed to the Yellow Sea during the Korean War. That evening, Byron and Tillman went down into the boiler room beneath the facility's edifice. In addition to the safekeeping of their patients, maintaining perimeter security was just as much of a priority to Dakai. Searching for any weak points in the facility's main building, any sectors or subdivisions in needs of repair, was just an excuse for Dakai to present himself before the state board and preach his propaganda to the state legislature just to receive more money for their budget. But in the end, he was just lining up his own pockets with cash to keep his mistress and himself happy. That is what legal practitioners refer to as embezzlement. Tillman pulled the cord, and a single 75-watt light bulb cast a sickish yellow glow over the area they stood in. The boiler was mounted on 4 cement blocks. A long copper-jacketed tank squatted beneath the confusion of pipes and ducts which climbed upward into the shadows and out of sight. Straight ahead was the elevator shaft. Heavy, lubricated cables descended to pulleys in a huge grease-clogged motor. In the far right corner, just at the edge of the light's reach, sat a stack of bundled, banded, and boxed papers. Records or receipts or invoices, perhaps, he thought. Yellowed, flimsy foot scabs spilled out from cardboard boxes doused in cable grease and gossamer. "There she is," Tillman exclaimed. "The heart of this place. She's old, but she still holds," he said with a wide and unpleasant grin. A blaring, hissing noise escaped one of the pipes up above. The sound of vapor and steel clashing together all at once sounded almost like a braying mule. "How old is this place?" Byron asked. "Older than I care to remember, but I believe about 100, maybe some 110 years old. Why do you care?" Just curious, I suppose." "Yes, I suppose most people would have questions when they walk into an environment such as this one. My motto? Hear no evil, see no evil. You'll live by those philosophies. You go home at the end of each day with a smile on your face and a paycheck in the mail." Ha 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 ha. Byron couldn't help but smile at this. "They should put that slogan on a billboard and mount it on the freeway," he added. "You're all right, Byron, you're all right. You got your head screwed on right. That goes a long way in here," he said, shuffling back to the elevator shaft. "Hey, Jared, you mind if I ask you something?" "Go on ahead and shoot," he replied. "You ever get an eerie sort of feeling about this place? Like something's going on here, maybe that's wrong?" He looked perplexed. "Well, whatever do you mean?" Byron went on. "You ever see anything odd walking around here at night?" Yeah, not much. Not much walking around here in daylight either. The only time most of these people are ambulant is when they get their daily recreation in the chicken run." No. I mean, something ever caught your eye out of place," Byron said. "Like something walking around the facility at night, maybe. You ever see anything like that?" Probably rats," he said, sneering at the term as if the mere taste of the word on his tongue was like chalk. "Damn things are an abomination to the eyes, ears, and nose. I see those at night, that's for damn sure. I can hear them scurrying about in the ducts, vents, and ceiling all hours of the night. You know that fat fairy upstairs would scream all the way to Worcester if she had to pay the pest control to come in and spray rat poison all up and down the corridors? Byron stood there and looked at him. That's it, huh? Just rats? Well, what else do you mean? Jared said. Byron considered telling him about the scratch marks on the back of Haskell's neck and the strange clicking sound he hears running up and down the corridors at night, but then he bit down on the inside of his cheek and decided not to pursue the subject any further. Nothing. I suppose it's all in my head, Byron said. As they walked away, Byron looked back into the impenetrable darkness of the dismal place. If there was ever a place that could be compared to hell, this is it, he thought. The sound of the furnace echoed back like a knell at a funeral service. Then there was the sound he'd heard before, the gentle clicking sound, like fingernails, or perhaps they sounded more like claws. Grandma, at any point did you ever start to consider the idea that Granddad might be unwell? John asked tentatively. She rounded her lips and looked out over the balcony at the prairie down below. The sheer tension of silence was blanketed by the coughing misfire of a Chrysler engine off somewhere in the distance. She contemplated her answer, then replied, Maybe for a little while I did, but when you have been married for as long as your grandfather and I had been, you start to have some form of insight about each other. You see things others can't see. You know things and you pick up on all their little quirks. We got hitched when we were 18. The following spring your father was born, and by 64, we were landowners and homeowners. Well, then why did you leave Maine? John asked. She didn't answer his question immediately. Her eyes cast down at the floor as sullen red rose began blooming in her cheeks. In a low, colorless voice, she replied, I can't remember what our reasons were, but I know now we were wrong to leave. Before then and all the time I knew your grandfather, not once did I consider him to be unwell. He was a loving father, devoted husband, but more importantly, he was a good man, a rational man. That place latched onto him like a parasite. John looked at his grandmother and then said, Grandma, tell me about the first real encounter. September 17th, 1968. 1968 remains arguably the most historic year in modern history. It was a year of triumphs and tragedies. The year began with the Tet Offensive in the midst of the Vietnam War. President Lyndon Johnson had signed the Civil Rights Act in 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead on April 4th at 7:01 in Memphis, Tennessee. Then, just 2 months after, Robert F. Kennedy was gunned down at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. The Apollo 8 moon landing was still a few months away, but things were looking better for a while. Byron grew accustomed to the norms at the hospital. Eventually, all the bantering and incongruous noises became like pleasurable sounds to his ears, like birds singing in the treetops, frogs greeting each other on lily pads, the sighing of a gentle breeze through a pine forest. When patients called out to people who weren't there, held conversations with total emptiness, or began mumbling incoherently to themselves, Tillman called it acting out of the tartar. Byron thought Tillman meant the patient's mental delusions and behaviors were brought on by hypertension. To anyone else it was bizarre, but to the employees at the hospital, it was just the usual routine of things. Another patient had committed suicide the night before last, a young schizophrenic, no more than 20, Samuel Mortimer. Byron remembered the event vividly. He remembered seeing the mob of staff members crowding around the doorway. There came the shrill cry of a woman. Byron pushed his way through the crowd and saw the position of the boy's body was in. He was still alive at the time. His hair was snow white. His body bounced and writhed around on the floor. Here was a creature older than time, masquerading as a boy. He saw 2 men restrain his wrists as clawed hands beat and twisted and danced in the air. Byron distinctly remembered seeing the boy's face. He'd clawed out his own eyes. The skin around his eyelids was cut into thin ribbons, blood gouted. Cackling and screeching as he tried reaching for his eyes, it was a scene Byron would not easily forget. On the wall above his bed was written, "It was more fun in hell." The very next night, the old woman in the next room over died of an explosive brain aneurysm. He remembered her lying on the floor. Blood dribbled out from her eyes, her ears, and her nose. This place was like an animal shelter that housed sick and diseased animals who sat in their cages all day and all night, waiting to be euthanized. On this night in September, Byron had himself another scare. One evening they had been laying traps baited with rat poison throughout the facility, a cheap and easy way for Dekai to keep his pockets full and keep the staff content. Byron went into the workers' bathroom afterwards to clean himself off. He wore gloves, a face mask, and then eye protection, but the idea of touching that toxic parasite killer made his skin crawl. As he pulled the plug and the water started to run out of the sink, that was when he heard it. Just as the sounds of the water began to die off, Byron heard a distinct voice, one which he had not heard in a very long time. It started off shallow, but then it grew louder. He leaned one ear over the drain and listened closely. It was the voice of his sister, Lydia, who had been taken by polio when she was just 8. He heard his sister down there. She was laughing somewhere down in those pipes, down there in the dark, laughing. His upper lip quivered. He thought maybe he was imagining things. He stared down into that black hole and in a shy whisper asked, hello? Without warning, the voice was cut off. He waited and listened carefully. There was nothing but sheer silence now. He called out once more, Lydia, Lydia, is that you? Then suddenly a whole slew of voices replied all at once. My name is Christopher. My name is Susan. Hey there, I'm Audrey. I'm Robert. I'm Joseph. Oh, hello. My name is Judith. Nice to meet you. His knees felt like rubber as the voices called back. He heard Lydia's voice a second time coming from the drain. Only now she was laughing wildly, like a crazy person would. A flare of anger surged through him. He yelled down the drain this time, God damn it! Who's playing a game on me? All at once the voices in the drain replied as the possessed man in the book of Matthew said, Our name is Legion, for we are many. Terror flew over him. Byron lost his balance and reeled backwards into the door. With a loud click, the door swung wide open and Byron began falling through the air, pinwheeling his arms like a madman. He landed on his rear end, then began to crawl away from the sink. Just as he looked up, he discovered Tillman standing over him. Jesus, Mary and Joseph, what got your knickers in a twist tonight there, Byron? Tillman asked. The sink. You need to go look at the sink? There's something wrong, Byron said. His skin was as pale as parchment and the appearance on his face was that of a man who has seen the Holy Ghost. Tillman, bewildered by Byron's panic, walked over to the sink and peered down into the dark drain. Then he turned back and said, Pipes in the building are older than Methuselah. You'll hear them making strange noises here and again, that's all. Byron was staggered by his response. You don't hear them? He wanted to ask but hesitated and knew Tillman would declare him crazy and try to lock him in a room if he started spewing nonsense about hearing voices in the drains. I mean, my God, what was he going to do? Start telling him that he could hear his late sister's voices in the dark? The warden would sure strap him to a gurney, lock him up, and throw away the key if they considered him telling anyone such nonsense, especially as a guard. Especially as a member of the staff. John didn't know what to think. And then his grandmother went on. You must think I'm storying you along, don't you, hun? Must be thinking I'm as crazy as a bedbug. I don't think you're storytelling, Grandma. I can tell you're telling the truth. I can see it on your face, John said. You know, we began to consider the idea of moving back to Maine for a little while after that. My father was a carpenter by trade and offered to take your grandfather under his wing as an apprentice until something more lucrative came up. But those plans never came to fruition. Eventually, we just let it go. I don't know why it just slipped our minds after a little while. I suppose when things became calm again, your grandfather decided to soldier on and hold his position at the hospital. You know, that's the kind of man he was." John then asked, "What happened then? Did it get any better?" His grandma replied, "Well, the voices never came back, at least that I know of. But that damn sure wasn't the end of it, that's for sure." With the building being so old, repairs were customary, especially to the night staff. When Dukai could not hire an additional member to their maintenance department, for unsaid reasons, the responsibility fell upon the night shift. The elevator had itself a case of the electrical hiccups. Byron was tasked to go down below and oil the cogs and runners some more, at least until the morning when the maintenance crew arrived. As he conducted his task, from out of his peripheral vision, the stack of records, receipts, and invoices beckoned him, and Byron's imagination started to run a little wild. They called out to him, "Don't be bashful, give us a read and see what all the commotion is about. You might find something interesting." Byron was very curious, especially with all the goings-on in the hospital, and he wanted to see what was going on in the records. Byron gave in to his interest and found himself standing over the stack of invoices, asking himself, what kind of psychiatric health facility leaves a stack of invoices down here in the darkest corner of its dwelling? The answer to that is no other place, only here. To his unwanted desire, Byron began leafing through the piles of records and old papers. He was hunched over the yellowed sheets, his jet black hair tumbling messily over his forehead. He looked slightly like a lunatic. There were some odd things tucked amongst the foot scalps of the records and things that were mostly disquieting. A letter dated June 5th, 1914. The letter reads, "To my dear sister, this institution allows me only to write twice a month. I write to tell you of my time in this place. They only give us a mattress for our rooms, which is festering with bedbugs and other things which crawl. The sounds of shrieks and groans haunt me day and night. I fear I will never get out of here. I am never to leave my cell to see these wretched creatures. I only hear them." Byron was taken by the voice of the man in this letter. There was no name on it, and it was enclosed in an envelope of any sorts. Instead, it waits down here, festering in this bottomless pit. He began leafing through other pieces of paper and discovered more writings to loved ones and friends on the outside, letters from patients to their families that evidently were never delivered, but instead discarded and hidden away in these boxes by staff. This was not the voice of an insane man. It was the voice of a sound man, a common man, a man with a sister, a man with a family on the outside who waited long to return home. He found another letter. "Dr. Arlander is the superintendent here at the sanatorium. He swears me to be of unsound mind, of incurable sickness as he calls it, and that he may keep me here as long as he deems necessary, and I know he will. I am angry. It is a monstrous crime to put anyone here. I wish you knew some of the atrocities the staff performs as a treatment to its patients. Orderlies are instructed by Dr. Arlander to carry out hydrotherapy. This method entails restraining a patient to a tub filled with scalding hot water in an attempt to calm their minds. Then there is what the staff refers to as the crate, in which a hospital bed with railings is placed upside down on top of another bed to form some type of cage. I was kept in this confined space for 6 days, with little food or water as punishment for my unsociable actions. I beg for the Grim Reaper to come and take me, but he does not come. I am to live out the remainder of my life here simply because of my anxiety and because I could not sleep at night. To inveigle me into this bedlam is an unforgivable sin of mother and father. Keep little Tabitha and Brandon away from here if you can, and never let a child of yours, should you bear any, ever come here. It is a place of evil which I cannot escape, holding on with great efforts. God be with you, William." Byron folded the paper in the palm of his hand and began to feel ill. His face began to turn red, his heart filled with hate which could only find catharsis in burning down this facility along with Dr. Dukai in it. He placed the paper back into the box, and then suddenly there was a strange, freezing sensation in his hand. At first, the feeling was mild, then stinging cold, turned to fire and began lurching through his veins, up his arm and into his brain. It was a pain so intense it locked up all the muscles in his arm. He withdrew his hand from the box, and to his discovery, what should he find? A rat. A rat had bit the webbing between his thumb and forefinger hard enough to bring blood. He lunged at the critter, grabbing him with both hands. It felt like holding something inert, like packed straw or sawdust, except for its aspirating sides. He felt its nappy fur crinkle under his hands, but the feeling was muffled, meager, like someone shot him full of Novocaine. His breathing was quick and dry, like the rattle of wind through straw. Byron then dropped the rat hurriedly. It stood on its hindquarters and hissed at him in the most agitated manner. It peered up at him with two small black eyes like fine beads of oil. In a fit of rage and revulsion, Byron brought his left foot up and then down on top of it. He heard a loud crunching sound, followed by a wet splat across the floor. Blood and liquefied intestines spurted from beneath his foot and doused his pant leg. He held his wounded hand close to his chest, feeling the warm blood mat the thick pelt that grew there. It thrashed around for a minute till finally it stopped moving. He stood on top of it for another minute or so, wanting to make sure it was dead and not just playing possum. Finally, he lifted his foot off the rodent and knew it was dead. Its entrails reduced to porridge, the blood on the floor turned gray like the inside of a pewter dish. He stared at the wound on his hand and nearly swooned over. Then he heard a faint chirping sound from up above him. He looked up and saw he was being monitored by a whole throng of rats. They lined every crack, every crevice, and every gap along the wall. They stood side by side like silent sentinels, like a rat army. His mouth parted slightly as they stared solidly at him. This cannot be happening, he thought. This must be some kind of nightmare. Byron pinched his forearm in an unsuccessful attempt to wake himself from what he believed to be a lurid dream. But he did not find himself lying in bed with his wife. Instead, he was still down there beneath that grim place up on Hospital Hill. Little by little, he began to move away from them, backpedaling slowly towards the stairwell. He would not run for the elevator as it was too far, and should it still not be fixed, he would be trapped in that steel box with his little acquaintances who witnessed him kill one of their own. In a split second, Byron turned and dashed for the stairs. His heart was a runaway stamping pressed in his chest, his eyes wide and his mouth swollen shut with fear. He leaped up the first set of steps. As he bounded a second time, his foot caught itself. In an instant, he fell forward and hit his head. A hazing feeling flew over him. His field of vision clouded and nearly blackened, and a voice rang in both of his ears. It was his inner self yelling at him to get up and keep moving. He sprang onto his feet and bounded forward, wobbled a bit, striking both walls as he scurried up the steps. When he came to the top, he slammed the door shut behind him, kicking up clouds of dust with it. In a sudden sense of relief, Byron's world tilted crazily, came back to level, then just went on moving until it was tilted in the other direction. Every time rational thought came back in his head, panic goosed the hairs on his arms and legs. He ran into the staff bathroom. His stomach contracted so violently that he almost didn't reach the toilet in time. His head flew forward over into the toilet bowl as chunks of food propelled from his mouth into the porcelain bowl, staining it a creamy chime. He sank his knees onto the linoleum floor as the last of it dribbled from his lips and his stomach turned over once more. He felt his head singing with a sharp, cutting pain that sliced keenly through his panic. After Byron cleaned himself and straightened his uniform up, he looked at the bite on his hand. The blood was just beginning to clot. He went over to the mirror and inspected his head wound. There was a small gash just above the right temporal lobe. There was something swelling and some ominous discoloration, but he was in no immediate danger. He went to the nurse's station. It was empty as anticipated. There were only 3 medical nurses available in the entire facility on the night shift, another one of Decay's budgeting problems. First, he disinfected the bite wound on his hand with a bottle of peroxide. An irksome sting shot through his arm and up his neck, giving him a mild migraine. He closed his eyes and bit down on his lower lip. After the pain washed away, he then wrapped it over an adhesive bandage. Then he tended to the wound on his head with Raleigh salve and another bandage. Was he going crazy? He began to think. Was this place turning him into a demented fool? Just as Byron closed the cabinet shut from his peripheral vision, at the corner of the doorway's threshold appeared an abhorrent black shape. He retched and made a disgusted sound at the sight of the being in the reflection of the glass cabinet. He almost fell backwards. As he turned to where he last saw the obscure figure, it vanished out into the corridor. Against his better judgment, Byron ran after it. Following the pitter-patter of what sounded like bare feet running on the cold, concrete floor, he shined his light down the corridor, and he tailed from being from a safe distance. He followed the pitter-patter of what sounded like bare feet running on the cold, concrete floor. He shined his light down the corridor, and tailed it from a safe distance, listening to movements up ahead. Suddenly, it stopped. Byron, who was now on the brink of turning white, also stopped. He waited and listened. Then he drew his baton from his waistband and held it close to his chest. Maybe it was his mind playing a ruse, just some farce his brain conjured up. Perhaps he was coming down with a fever. Perhaps he had contracted rat bite fever and his head was in disarray of delusion. Then he realized something he had not heard before in all his time spent in the hospital. Silence. The corridor was noiseless. There were no cries, no wails, no cackles, no forms of gibberish carried out into the hallway. It was then that Byron felt completely terrified. Suddenly, the corridor erupted in an aviary of screaming voices. The voices appeared out of thin air. All around him, screeching sounds of dying people rang in his eardrums. All the doors to all the cells flung wide open. It was like magic. Byron drew back in fear. The lights in all the rooms flickered on in abnormal sequences. In the faint light, he saw something standing in the middle of the hallway. It was back. It was tall and dark, pitch black even, as black as obsidian. Its spade-clawed hands swayed back and forth at its side. It had legs like the trunk of an ancient oak tree, feet like sprawling roots with 5 talons on each foot. Its head had no features, no eyes, no mouth, no snout, no ears or anything, just an empty, swollen, black mass. It was something that could never have survived under the eye of the sun. Nature would have forbidden it. But in here, nature had taken on a different form. Byron's mouth was wide open and rigid, his chalky face gaunt and immobile, his fists clenched with blanched knuckles as his fingernails dug into the palms of his hand, and his life flashed before his eyes. Byron Hotz, who had slid down Hathaway Hill in the blackness of nighttime in the middle of a blizzard. Byron Hotz, who was the first to take any dare and brave enough to take on any obstacle ever given to him, was howling out of utter fright at the abomination he saw before him. Whatever this was trudged forward under the uncertain light, the low tapping sound of its talons drumming against the concrete floor it made with every step. Tap, tap, tap. From the being's vacant face came a single statement. "It's longer than an eternity in here, for this place is truly hell." A huge, tenebrous, squeaking sound seemed to appear out of nowhere. Suddenly, from out of the rooms and into the hallway, ranks upon ranks of rats flooded the corridor. The whisk and pitter-patter of small feet scurried down the passage. Heaps of their tiny furry bodies trapezed over his feet. His heart turned to ice. Byron began to scream. He began screaming against the sound of the wind reaving against the leaves, tearing through the hallway like a shard of glass. From behind him a light appeared. Tillman was there, and he walked up with a stone-cold look of horror as he saw Byron bouncing and writhing on the ground of that desolate hallway, slashing and clawing at the air as if something were on top of him. The sounds of choked, lunatic cries and cackles radiated from Byron's throat. Other nurses and staff members followed behind and to their discovery saw the twisted look of insanity on Byron's face. Byron flailed and thrashed on the floor like a fish on a wharf, screaming in a high-pitched voice. He then laughed, a disturbed laugh. It was an insane laughter, the laughter of the incurable. John's grandma then looked at him, with the disbelief in her eyes that she had had this whole time since that day. "He lost his vertical hold on life. They deemed him to be crazier than an outhouse rat. That place fed on him like a disease, eating away at him little by little." John was struck with silence. He simply listened to his grandmother's anecdotes. They locked him up that day in that very place. I tried hard to get him transferred to McLean's or Brattleboro, where I knew he could get better treatment. I visited him only twice while he was housed there. It was on my second visit, when he was of sound mind, to recount that final night and the dark thing in the corridor. There was a long pause after that, until finally John asked, "What was it, Grandma?" She looked upon him with rivers of wrinkles flowing down from the corners of her eyes and a dismal expression. She chose her words carefully. It was a type of force that does not belong on Earth. It was the type that grows and acts and shapes itself by other laws than those that govern our existence. John merely retorted with a slight nod of the head, as if saying he understood what she meant to say. But in truth, he could not understand what she was saying, and not sure if he ever would understand. It was on my bus ride home that day from Brattleboro that he had hung himself. I felt somehow guilty that I was not able to save him. At that moment, John's grandma looked at him in the eye and said, "You still thinking about writing a story about that old hospital hill?" John replied, "I'm still thinking about it, but I'm not sure if I want to get into it." Then John's grandma replied, "All I ask is one thing of you, John. Do not go up Route 66, and don't go to see that hospital. Leave it where it lies to fester in its squalor. Evil still lives there. I can tell you that for certainty." John then went over to his grandma, hugged her, kissed her on the cheek, and left. John had a lot on his mind, and he had a story to tell.